Telling stories is a powerful way of communicating and of creating or building relationships. There's been a few stories told over lunch, and they tell us about who we are, the world in which we live, and what's important to us. They help us create bonds with one another, whether it's sharing the good events that happen in our lives, the bad, or the everyday. We can use our stories in union work as ways to build our collectives based on our values as individual members and of delegates. We can use our stories in our union work as ways to build our collective based on our values and our individual members and delegates. We're in an ever-shifting world, and that world has an impact on the environment in which we work and live. As a union, we need to be responsive to those changes and look to the new ways to help us build the strength of our union. In order to do that, we can achieve wins to benefit our members and our communities. This afternoon's session is about telling our stories in ways that will move people to understand the connection between our individual selves, our professional work as nurses and midwives, and our union work as delegates, branch officials, and active members. And it's from that understanding that we can engage with others to be part of our activities. Whether it's joining our union or becoming more involved in our branches or campaigns, or being part of the greater union movement. In a moment, we'll hear stories from 4 delegates who are leaders in their workplaces and communities. But first, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Hahrie Han, who some of you heard yesterday at our professional day. Welcome, Hahrie. So Hahrie is a Professor of Political Science at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She specialises in the study of civic and political participation, collective action, social change, and democratic revitalisation. Hahrie is especially interested in how organisations can increase the participation of ordinary people. Now, isn't that your greatest challenge? Not carrying all the load yourself, but getting and organising others to work alongside you to carry the great load that we have to make our union stronger, our workplaces better. So Hahrie's recent book, How Organisations Develop Activists, Civic Associations and Leadership in the 21st Century, provided a comparative research-based analysis of what makes some organisations more effective than others. This afternoon, Hahrie will be sharing some strategies and techniques for how we can connect with our stories of self to increase our engagement with members and potential members in our branches. There will, of course, be time at the end for questions for our panellists. I'd now like you to welcome our 4 member leaders who are each going to share their stories of what compels them to act at this moment in time. Jane Cotter, an RN delegate from Goulburn Base Hospital Branch. Andrew Rigg, an RN and delegate from Lingard Private Hospital Branch. Heather Frank, a delegate RN from Gunnedah District Hospital. And Glenn Hayes, RN and delegate from Illawarra Shoalhaven Mental Health Nurses Branch. Join me in welcoming them all. And I've missed. So, I understand, Hahrie, you're going to invite Jane up to speak. Is that right? I'll leave you with it.
Okay. Great. Thank you. When I first sat down and did this, I found it to be a really good exercise because I hadn't really thought about what motivated me to be a member of the union or anything. Not really. I mean, I've always been a member of the union, but to sit down and really try and drill down. And I figured that really what it is that I'm motivated by social justice. I'm a great believer in social justice, and it started when I was quite young. My father was a docker in the London docks, and he was a union leader. And there were a lot of strikes, and there was a lot of hardship. There's no strike pay. There used to be a lot of ill feeling towards my father because he was seen as this person who was causing, disruption with the workers, to the extent that we had a brick thrown through our window, and my father had to be escorted home by other unionists because of danger at that time. There was a lot of unrest in the 50s and 60s in London. And then when I was in 1968, I became influenced and politicised by the student movement in Paris and elsewhere when there was that great uprising, and I dressed totally in black, and I followed Jean-Paul Sartre, and it seemed to fit really well with the age I was at that time. Then I was involved in the anti-Vietnam marches, and when I sat down and looked through all this, I thought, oh gee, I was quite active. I used to go in the anti-Vietnam marches and then also the anti-apartheid marches and demonstrations about anti-apartheid when the Springboks came and so on. I generally went to all the May Day marches, even when I was younger and in my 20s. And then when I started nursing, way back in January 71, we didn't have equal pay. And male nurses were paid more than I was just because they had different genitalia. And I didn't think that was fair. And then so the stirrings of feminism really started then. In Adelaide, I was a branch official in what was then the Royal Australian Nursing Federation, and I was involved in strikes then for pay and so on. And then when I went to university, because I had a break from nursing and went into university, I was a member of the Blue Stocking group at uni, which is a feminist group. When the Your Rights at Work campaign was kicked off, I was a member of the union, but I wasn't that active. I had small children and so on. So what I did then was, but I had a stall in the main street of Bowral, actually. Every Saturday morning, I'd be there handing out pamphlets and so on, and tackling John Hewson and the like. So I was very active in the Your Rights at Work campaign. In Goulburn, we've had two big campaigns. The biggest ones were the health forum that we held, and more recently, of course, the anti-privatisation action. What I found is that members are more responsive, or most responsive, when the issue affects them directly or their families, obviously. If it's going to affect you, you're going to be more motivated to do something about it. We had a really good turnout for the ratios. For that whole ratios campaign, when we went on strike, we got a bus. We went by bus into Homebush. And then when the metropolitan hospitals got ratios and we didn't, they became really disillusioned. We did all of that and we didn't get them and so on. And they were very angry and they weren't even going to vote for that particular log of claims when we didn't get the ratios. They did vote in the end. When we did the health forum, we had to get beyond that disillusionment. So they were a bit jaded by it all, but we put it to them that they were special because Goulburn had been chosen to have this health forum, and so we put really special. We've been chosen to do this. And they took off with that. They really did take off. So their ideas of publicity were really good. They got it dressed up in period uniforms. They painted a big sign. We didn't give them any prompting. They worked that out for themselves. And likewise, we had electronic signs as you drove into Goulburn. And those sort of things came from the members, not from us, which I was really pleased about. I thought that was great. Sorry, I'm going to turn this page, which is stuck together. In both of those, in the campaign for privatisation and the health forum, but especially in the beginnings when we did the health forum, we actually forged relationships. So we had the involvement of the local unions, the Goulburn district unions, and other unions too, so that when the members saw that those other unions were supporting them, they felt really good and they felt there was real solidarity, they were supported. So when we did our march down the street, the police actually stopped the traffic for us because they were part of Goulburn district unions, so they knew we were going to be doing it and all that sort of thing. Electricity workers came and rallied with us, teachers rallied with us, and that was really important. In a country town, it's really important that, that we're all together like that. We used social media. We set up a Facebook group so that we had instant communication. We found that was really important. And having done all that with the health forum and built all those relationships, when the threat of privatisation came, it was easier to mobilise the members because we'd had that experience with the health forum and because it was a direct threat to them. We'd been in the markets, we went to markets, and whenever we've been doing campaigns and petitions, we tend to have representation at the markets. We've got blue wigs we put on, which match our scrubs, so we show up. In the privatisation, they got very involved in door knocking, which was really good. Because we'd built all those relationships, and I really keep going on about relationships, but it's so important. With the unions, New South Wales and the ALP and the Greens, I went to political meetings, like the political party meetings and so on. But we'd built all those relationships, so it was really easy to ramp it up quickly for the privatisation. With the local member, we've bonded with the local member. She doesn't always do what we'd like her to do, but we always get in to see her, and she is always ready to talk to us. And that was a bit hard at first. When I first went in to see our local member, I was really nervous. But the organiser, who happened to be Darius, came with us, and that first time, once we got through that first time, we were okay. What we've found is being visible in the community is important, but not just during campaigns, but all along. So it comes on the radio and papers. The community get to know the face of the nurses' union. And so then we get the radio, ringing us up to ask us, what do we think about the Ebola outbreak and so on. So we've become this sort of face of health, and that's really good. We did politics in the pub. That kind of started a while ago too, and that's been really important. And again, that's with all unions are involved in that. But it's a really good forum. But we do need to be active outside the major campaigns, as I said. So politics at pub, being involved in the markets, it is really important to keep it going, because once you get known, it's a lot easier. You actually can get papers to listen to you. You can actually get articles in the paper. You can get them to come and take photos of you. And that's really important. And then you get other things. When we had the privatisation, we had the different support groups contacting us. They knew who to contact. And that's really important, to be visible and known. And that's about all, really, I think. Thank you.
Afternoon, delegates. My name's Andrew Rigg, and I joined the association back in 1992 when I graduated, so I missed out on all the fun marches with the Vietnam and what have you. But anyway, so I've been a unionist for a while, but that was before I was. But before that, I was introduced to the union movement as a child. I come from a multi-generational line of merchant seamen. My father, my uncles, grandfather and great-uncles were all members of the Seamen's Union of Australia, which was the precursor of the current MUA. And they were definitely socialists and quite probably had the odd communist in amongst them as well. Through my father's family, I got to read the Seamen's Voice, which was their version of The Lamp, and I got to see many of my father's workmates and acquaintances in the Soviet Union meeting members of the Politburo, and there's one of them actually meeting Leonid Brezhnev, who was the president of the Soviet Union at the time. So activism and militancy were constant topics of discussion in the backyard, and quite often those discussions became full-blooded arguments, if not wrestling matches. On the other side of my family, my mother morphed as I grew up from a Carol Brady type of mother, driving us around to sporting events and schools and packing our lunches, to a Mary Tyler Moore type character when she entered the workforce. Then after a sudden and difficult marriage breakdown, she became a Jermaine Greer type warrior. As we were living in and this isn't funny, as we were living in a women's and children's refuge for about 9 months, and we saw a passing parade of battered and bruised mothers and children. It was at this time she made me read force-fed me The Female Eunuch. I was going through puberty at the time. It was I don't know if you've read The Female Eunuch, but it's a read. So I grew up and studied, became a nurse, and I married another strong, independent woman, a very strong, independent woman. I have 2 daughters who are starting their own journey. One of them the other night called into our welcome drinks and asked Brett what hospital he worked at. And I'm not sure who was more taken aback, myself or Brett. So that's who I am. I'm a son, husband, father, nurse, and unionist. But that doesn't explain how I got to here. I got here because I said yes. I said yes to Catherine Rinn 2 weeks ago, who asked me if I'd like to speak after Harry's recent workshop for most of us when we were at the Waterloo office. But that wasn't the first yes that got me here. The first yes was back in 1992 when I joined the association. I was working up at the Royal Rehab Centre in the brain injury unit, and my senior RN at the time gave me the form and said, you will sign this. I had no other option. I said yes. So then I said yes to becoming an active member of that branch. Another series of yeses saw me become a branch official and a delegate as I moved around the health system. I said yes at John Hunter's campaign to have air conditioning into the hospital, because air conditioning installed into the hospital, because I couldn't understand why, when you build a modern hospital in the 80s and 90s, that you wouldn't put air conditioning into the ward area. You'd accommodate the office staff, but you wouldn't worry about your nurses and your patients. And this issue came to a head as we had bushfires lapping the edge of John Hunter Hospital, and we had recorded temperatures in the wards of up to 48 degrees Celsius. So we had a campaign where we introduced drink breaks for staff as we recorded the air temperature with our thermometers, and staff were encouraged to take a 10-minute drink break. And that rolled on. And as through the course of the campaign, I found out that the saving of not putting the air conditioning in at the start was $2 million. It ended up costing them $32 million to put the air conditioning in, so not much of a saving there, but we got it. Then I said yes to the public health system's ratio campaigns, where we closed beds, we went on strike, we got community on side because they couldn't understand why nurses couldn't get their job done, because they were battling, because they didn't have another nurse to do their work, to help everybody get through and provide the patient care that we need to provide, that the patients need us to provide. And it wasn't poor time management on my part, it wasn't poor time management on your part or our colleagues' part, it was just that we didn't have the staff there, and we won that. So as I said, I now work at Lingard Private, which is in the only Conservative enclave in Labor voting Newcastle, which, as we heard yesterday, is the city that most reflects Australia. Very parochial, us Novocastrians will take anything. So now I've said yes to the association's EBA negotiations with Healthy Care. And hello, I'm back fighting another ratio battle. because I don't understand why a patient who has paid their health insurance to get the doctor they want can't get the nurse they need. I don't understand why I work in a rehab ward where my ratio is 1:6, and my roommate, Gary O'Driscoll, who works down the South Coast Mental Health Unit for the same company, works 1:9. I don't understand the disparity. Same company, different rules. I'm here and I said yes because it should be one rule for all, and that rule should be one for four. So that's how I got here. I kept on saying yes because I believed in the union, I believed in collective action, and I believe in the results that we've achieved with that. My challenge now to me is that I need to ask others in the private system without their generally conservative beliefs that they need to say yes to getting involved and engaged, because without their help and assistance, we're not going to get our ratios. So I need them to say yes to joining the association, yes to engaging in campaigns, yes to fighting the good fight for our ratios, for better conditions and for better pay for our nurses. So for me, every yes has been a step into the unknown, but every yes has, up until now, had a positive outcome, and that's why I'm here. Thank you.
I just said to Andrew, how do I follow that? That was brilliant. Yeah, great. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brett Heather Frankie. Okay. I was born in a very small country town in northwest New South Wales, and I went to school there, I worked there, I got married, I had my children, and 54 years later I'm still living there. So I was born in August, so I'm a Leo the Lion, and my traits are supposed to be loyalty, trustworthy, and a leader. So we'll see how that goes. So my story continued when I was 8. My father went to hospital in the back of an ambulance, like he'd done many times before, but this time he didn't come home, and that was when I decided I was going to be a nurse. I didn't want any other children to be without their mother or father, and I was going to change the world. 8-year-olds can do that. And my mum was 34 years old. I was number 4 of 6 children, so we were aged between 13 and 5. So it was a real struggle watching Mum try to put food on the table and to give us what we needed. We never got what we wanted, we only got what we needed, because I grew up wearing second-hand clothes and shoes, and that's just what it was. Until I turned about 12, and then I had to wear my younger brother's clothes. So that was a bit tough because they were getting bigger than me. So when I went to school, I went to a private school paid for by Legacy. The kids there all had money, we didn't. So I was ridiculed a little bit at school by my classmates because I had second-hand uniforms, second-hand shoes, and I didn't go on the excursions because Mum just couldn't afford that, but that's what it was. So there's 2 ways to deal with what life gives you, I guess. You can build a wall and just use that wall to protect yourself, and that's pretty much what I did as a kid. The second thing I did was turn everything into a joke, because I'd rather people laugh at me or with me than to, laugh with me instead of laugh at me. I guess that's what it was, and that's probably my strongest personality today. My beautiful grandmother once told me, don't cry because your tears are not going to turn into money. You just need to get on with your life and make it. I really admired this woman. She grew up not being able to read or write. She married a man who couldn't read or write. He was a World War I veteran. He saw fighting at the end of the Gallipoli campaign. He fought in Egypt and the Western Front and came home alive, which was a pretty big feat, I think. He joined up again in the Second World War, and he was on guard duty in Sydney and got ran over by a truck and broke his back. So he spent many years in a Sydney hospital, and back then there were ration coupons given my grandmother didn't need the ration coupons for the clothing, so she used to go down to the front of Myers and wait for the girls to come out after work, and they'd trade her their flour coupons for the clothing coupons. You know, I mean, very, very smart woman, very smart for someone who couldn't read or write. She was amazing. Like, after my grandfather got out of hospital, they resumed their nomadic lifestyle. They just travelled. They picked fruit. My grandfather used to work as a rouseabout in shearing sheds. My grandmother used to cook for the shearers. They'd travel along the road, and back in those days, you used to get a refund on your water bottles, drink bottles. So the kids would scour the road and they'd pick up all the drink bottles that the people had thrown out, and Grandma would wash them out, and she'd take them back and get a sixpence or whatever it was for the bottle on that day. My grandfather used to pick the wool off the fence. When the sheep get itchy, they rub up against the barbed wire fence. So he'd pick that wool off, and then he'd dry that wool at night around the fire and then sell it to the wool buyers. It wasn't like a bale of wool, but it was enough to get them by and put food on the table. I used to wonder how enterprising these beautiful couple would have been if they could have read and, you know, been able to write. My grandmother used to encourage me to do the best I could at school, and so proud of me when I came first in second class. It was the only time I ever come first, so at least I did one thing right. So when I was 16, I was in year 10, and we used to do work experience, and I went to the hospital so excited. I just wanted to be a nurse, and the girls thought it'd be a good idea to show me what it was about, so they put me in a shower to shower a man. He had no clothes on. I'd never seen a naked man in my life. I was so embarrassed, and I actually thought, you know, I don't think I'm actually old enough for this. I'll go back to school and finish year 12. So about this time, things changed, and we were going from the hospital system to the uni system. And I thought, how the hell am I going to pay for uni, you know? Then Mum got sick, and I left school to help look after my younger brothers, and then I met my husband at 18. We got married when I was 19, and I settled into the life of a farmer's wife and raised my 2 children. So 15 years later, we moved back into Gunnedah, and there was an ad in the paper for an enrolled nurse. Every year I seen this ad, and I'd always think, oh, I'd love to do that. And I thought, well, am I too old? I was 35 at the time. And I thought, you know, I'll apply. So I told people that I applied, and they said, oh, you won't get in first go. Oh, righto. So yeah, I did. I got an interview. Oh, just because you got an interview doesn't mean you'll get in. Oh, okay. But I did. Got in, surprised everyone. So it was great. Completed my enrolled nurse training in 98, and went to work at Tamworth, Manila, Gunnedah. Full job at Manila at the time, and then I decided I'd do my RNs because you could do it by correspondence, and yeah. So I did that. 2008, I finished. Just my dream, I'd done it, you know, like I was old, but I'd done it. So when I was working at Manila, I was elected as their delegate, and I used to come down to the Committee of Delegates meetings, and honestly, I had no idea what was going on. I didn't do boat training. I just used to come and sit there and think, wow. I remember Charles. Like, that was an eye-opener. But anyway, then I moved back to Gunnedah and to work, and I got elected as a delegate there, but that hospital had a very negative attitude to unions and to you being a delegate and going away to meetings and that. So again, I didn't do too much, and that branch actually folded. I can see why now. Then 2 years ago, 2 of the staff members, Jennifer Crowe and Rachel Friend, decided that action needed to be taken on the disparities at the hospital, and that they would reform the union, and they asked me to be the delegate. And I said yes, with a little bit of trepidation, but it's just completely different now. The staff, bar 2 members, are all on board. I feel really supported by our active members, and the issues at our workplace are slowly being resolved. But we've got a long way to go, and we need to continue to work towards that. So I've come to Sydney and done some of the trainings specific for delegates, and that's helped me a lot because it's taught me how to do things. So we recently had a campaign where we wanted members of our community to know what was going on at the hospital because they don't know unless you tell them. So we got the CWA involved, we got our hospital auxiliary involved, we got the mothers who have little babies that present to the hospital all the time involved. So we were just picking out which people to get involved. We're still working on other groups to let them know because we haven't stopped because nothing has changed. We got our extra night, extra RN for our night duty, but we lost an EN in the process, and that's not what we wanted. So we need to keep going. So we've also spoken to our local Nationals member. Didn't get very far with him, I can tell you. So I used to be a National supporter because I was married to a farmer. Even my husband's not voting Nationals next election, he tells me, so things are coming a long way. So the Ratios campaign for us is about securing the right number of nurses at our hospital to provide the safe care to our community. So that's a community that I've lived in for the last 54 years, you know. I practically know everyone that walks through the door, and you know their background and you know that they deserve better. A lot of them don't have private health insurance, so they don't go to your hospital, Andrew, but they still deserve to have the right amount of nurses, regardless of their socioeconomic backgrounds, and they need us to continue to educate. They need us to fight for them. So our staff at Gunnedah have done a big 360 in their attitude towards the union and towards campaigning. We did a campaign where we walked down the main street and no one put their name up to say they were coming, and I rang Fiona on the morning of and I said, I don't think anyone's coming, this is going to be disastrous. They came, but they just didn't want anyone to know they were coming, and the ones that came were the ones that I didn't think would come, so that was really encouraging for us. So that's given us and the rest of the branch, you know, encouragement to keep going. So I'm working on being a leader for our union branch. I want to instill the passion about our cause, and I'm trying all different ways to engage our members. So our story will continue. So watch this little lion roar. Thank you.
Wow, what hard acts to follow. And Andrew, it is a remarkable word, yes. It most certainly is. Welcome, everyone. Today I've been asked to share my story with you and how I came to be standing here today. I was born in 1965. At 6 weeks of age, I was adopted. My birth mother, who I didn't know, was about 15 years of age. And the parents of my parents that adopted me have always brought me up knowing this fact. I have always felt loved and included in terms of my family. My parents worked as labourers. My dad too, Heather, was actually illiterate, or is illiterate, and he's a 70-odd-year-old man who didn't learn how to read or write. Mum passed away about 20 years ago, was a very unwell lady and had multiple health complaints. But they were a very, very loving and supportive family. I grew up in Landsvale, which is in southwest Sydney, near Cabramatta. While growing up, I was actually influenced by one of our local politicians, funnily enough. I met this large, imposing man who gave me some advice one day when I was a boy. I had no idea how to respond to an inquiry of his. He asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. I just stood there mute. But his advice was to be a good man, there are too few of them, and to learn as much as you can. His name was Gough Whitlam. Little did I know how important his advice would be to educate myself. I began nursing as an enrolled nurse in 1984, 6 months after the final intake of registered nurses at Concord Hospital. And at the time, I actually recall not being able to join the nurses' union. We had to belong to the HEF enrolled nurses, I believe. I was not really an active member of the union for many years, and my parents never really took a great interest in union politics or politics in general. During this time, though, I did realise the importance of education. I obtained a teaching diploma, a Bachelor of Nursing, and the advice was taken. I educated myself, but I also realised that education offered empowerment, not just for me, but for the people that I actually looked after as well. I grew increasingly concerned over issues such as inequality, poverty, neoliberalism that was taking such a huge shape in terms of the world around me. And in 2004, I had a life-changing event. I became a father. And for the very first time in my life, I knew another human being that I was actually directly related to. At this period of time, my unit had actually been investigating the implementation of 12-hour shifts, which had actually been included in the award, but was being denied by our management. I wanted to do this so that I could actually partake in my daughter's schooling, attend excursions, reading, canteen, doing all those things that I could actually do to bond myself with her. Needless to say, our management refused, and they expected no recourse after their decision. Fortunately, we had an outstanding delegate in our workplace, and she's about to become a life member, Angela Pridham. And we also had a wonderful organiser of a similar calibre, Lisa Kremer. I became an active unionist. I could not have had better mentors. These are the people that I've tried to emulate in terms of actively encouraging people to participate in all of the things that we do. It was the shared responsibility and unity of purpose that really inspired me. It was a difficult campaign, and over 14 months, we were threatened, abused, intimidated, and as we proceeded up the health service ladder with Illawarra executives, South East Sydney executives, New South Wales Health, Industrial Relations Commissions, eventually we even blocked the Health Minister's faxes by sending him over 2,000 faxes and closing his office down. I got a phone call at work from one of the meetings here, from Angela, informing us that the Health Minister had authorised the 12-hour shifts on the spot. It was one of the first campaigns that I'd actually taken a major role in, and it's one that since that time I have become extremely active. One of the first notable changes that I have seen in terms of the 12-hour shifts is how much organised today we are becoming, which is really vital because the resources that we have amassed against us are enormous. Without changes to the way we mobilise and organise, we would never have enjoyed the success so far that we have in our privatisation campaign. But the reason I'm here today, and the reason our campaign has been so successful, is finding that emotive connection. Our current campaign over the privatisation actually began with a meeting at our hospital. I turned up with my big anti-privatisation folder with all the facts and figures and details. But one of the first things I noticed from the people that we were actually delivering this to was the shock, the anger, and the surprise at the decision, because it didn't reflect our personal values or the personal values that we felt that our union held. It was this passion and our shared connection to this cause that actually delivered, I think, some of the results that we've actually seen today from some of our members in Wyong, and some of our members in Goulburn, and some of our members in Bowral. And it was their connection and their emotive connection to this issue and the values that they display in terms of their unionism and towards their community that have actually secured this. And I think that's something today in terms of our own personal stories that is probably the most important thing that we can take away, is how this affects us emotionally, because if it's not emotionally connected, it's just another issue. So thank you for hearing my story.
Well, wow. Can you guys just join me in giving everyone on the panel just a round of applause? It takes a lot of courage to sort of stand up in front of a few hundred people and tell your story, and I really admire what you all did. So thank you for kicking us off that way. What I want to do now is really just kind of try to interpret why it is that the stories that we just heard, why are those stories so powerful, right? So because part of what I want to do is by helping us kind of understand how stories work, it allows us to become more intentional about using stories in a way to engage others. And so the way this sort of next hour or so is going to go is I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview of how stories are going to work, and then we're going to actually give all of you in your seats the opportunity to practice telling your stories in the way that we just heard from the folks on the panel, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So to get started, just thinking about sort of why it is that stories work. Stories really... The reason why stories are so powerful in the kind of change work or the union work that you all are doing is because stories are fundamentally the things that kind of move people to act, right? How does change begin? Like, what's the first thing you need if you want to change anything? In your workplace, in your branch office? What is the first thing that needs to happen? You need a catalyst, right? Someone has to make a choice. Right? Someone has to make the choice to say yes, just like what Andrew told us, right? Well, how is it that people get to that moment where they make that choice, right? What we know from years and years and years of research, right, across neuroscience and science and social science and all different kinds of things, is that the choice for people to act comes not just from the head, it comes also from your heart, right? Because we spend so much of our lives thinking about strategy, right? We spend so much of our lives thinking about how is it that I'm going to solve the problems that I have, right? And we develop these elaborate strategy documents, and we create organizational strategies, and we create campaign strategies, and we do all this work to sort of develop a sort of roadmap for how we're going to get from where we are now to where we want to be, right? That's all the head work, and it's important, right? But if you want to get someone to sort of become that catalyst, right, if you want to get someone to begin to sort of make that choice to say yes that Andrew described to us, what you also need is they need not to understand not only how they're going to act, they need to understand why, right? And that choice of why they're going to act, it comes not from the head, it comes from the heart, right? And it's through our hearts, it's through the stories and our emotions, right, that we're able to sort of access the reasons that move us to action. And so the choice to act is not only about sort of how we're going to act, it's also about why we're going to act, right? If you have a strategy but you don't have any motivation, it's like having a roadmap for where to go but not knowing where it is that you want to go. Right? And what stories do essentially is they help us understand why we're going to act so that we can call others to join with us in taking those actions. And so really what stories do essentially is they help us articulate our values in a way that inspires emotions, right? And those emotions are what call people to action, right? Because that heart, what it's speaking to is speaking to the emotions that call people to action, right? So then one question to ask is, what are values, right? If I was to say, that we're motivated by our values, like what does that actually mean, right? Because values are this sort of like really abstract kind of thing, right? It's hard to understand, right? But what do we learn from hearing Glenn and Heather and Jane and Andrew talk to us about them, right? We learned a little bit about who they are, and by telling us their stories about who they are, we learned about what their values are, right? So what are values in that context? Values essentially are experiences, okay? So what do I mean by that? So here's the way our brain works, right? You guys probably know all this because you're nurses, right? You probably know more about the human body than I do, but here's what I know, okay? So at any given moment, right, we're standing here and all of us in this room, there are thousands of sort of stimuli of things that are coming at us right now, right? You guys are sitting in your chairs right now and there's all this stuff coming at you, right? You're hearing me speak, you're probably a little bit bored, maybe some of your phones are ringing, right? Maybe you're thinking about dinner, right? Maybe you're thinking about your kids, you're gonna have time to talk to them, like there are all these things that are kind of coming at you, right? Same with me, right? I've got a mosquito bite on my foot that's a little bit itchy, I'm a little thirsty, right? There's someone in the back who's playing on their phone, that's not so good, Coral's not paying attention, where does she go? There's sort of like all this stuff going on, right? And I'm trying to pay attention to all those things, right? And the way that my brain works is that at any given moment, we have millions of stimuli coming at us. And our brain essentially prioritizes some of those stimuli to pay attention to and pushes most of those down so that we just don't even recognize that they're happening, right? So now how does your brain know which of those stimuli are important and which of those aren't important? Right? How is my brain standing here right now and telling me, don't worry about that itchy bug bite, right? But pay attention, coral disappeared, right? Like how does my brain know what's important and what's not important? Okay, the way my brain knows what's important and what's not important is through experience. Because what my brain is sort of realizing is that over time, when I ignored the itchy bug bite in the past, it was fine. Nothing happened, right? No big deal. But when I didn't pay attention to the fact that people were getting up and leaving the room, that was a big deal, right? So I need to do something differently if people are getting up and leaving the room, right? And so essentially, that process of prioritizing which of our stimuli to pay attention to and which of our stimuli not to pay attention to, that's what your emotional systems do. Right? And so what moves us to action is when our emotional systems say, hey, there's a problem, you need to pay attention. Okay? So what stories are doing essentially is stories are calling our brains to act by calling on our emotional systems to push something up for our brains to prioritize. Do you guys see what I'm saying? Right? So the values that we're calling on through our stories, those values are not abstract ideas. These values are essentially experiences that help us remember what it is that we want to act on. Right? If I got a call right now saying that my kid was in trouble, I would drop everything and go answer that call. Right? Because my kids are at the core of what's important to me, and my brain knows that, right? So essentially what stories do then is they call on our values, right, to activate emotions that then inspire action, right? And we know that there are all sorts of emotions that take people away from taking action and actions that inspire action, right? So what are the reasons that people don't act, right? Because it's too hard, right? It's a lot easier to keep doing the same thing than to do something different. That's inertia, right? Because they don't care, right? What's the difference? Why should I take action, right? That's apathy, right? Fear, right? I don't want to act because I'm scared I'm going to lose my job, right? Isolation, why should I act when I'm just acting by myself, right? These are all emotions that sort of inhibit action, right? And the kind of stories that you all can tell are stories that are going to motivate action. Right? And so what are the emotions that we want to call on if we want to motivate action, right? We want to create a sense of urgency, right? This isn't a problem that you can act on tomorrow. You got to act on that now, right? We want to create a sense of anger, right? And anger is a disconnect between the world as it is and the world as it should be. We talked about this yesterday for those of you who were there yesterday, right? It's the idea that there is something, the world should be different than how it is now, right? You want to give people a sense of hope. Right? And so what the stories do essentially is by telling stories, right, we're able to sort of teach people why we act and why other people should act. Does that make sense? You guys with me? Okay, so then how do stories work, right? How is it that the stories that Jane and Andrew and Heather and Glenn told us, why were they so powerful, right? So it turns out, here's a secret, okay? Here's a secret that Hollywood has known for millions of, I don't even know how long they've been around. Hundreds of years, right? But they've made billions of dollars off this secret, okay? Stories have a very clear structure to them, right? And that structure is pretty simple, right? Here's how stories work, right? First, there's a character that you identify with, right? If you're telling a story about yourself, who's the character? Me, right? And then what happens is that character faces a challenge, okay? And then in response to that challenge, that character makes a choice. And based on the choice that character makes, we learn something about that character. That's the outcome. Okay? So let me give you an example. What if I said, I woke up this morning and I took a shower and I came to the conference. Is that a story? Boring. Okay. Why is that not a story? Okay, there's no challenge, right? So what if I said, I woke up in the morning and I took a shower and I got in the car and I came to the conference, but I had a car accident on the way. Is that a story? What's that? Okay, some people are saying yes and some people are saying no. Those of you who are saying no, why is it not a story yet? What's that? Heather says there's no choice, right? Have you learned anything about me, except for the fact that maybe I'm a bad driver, okay? Like, have you learned anything about me yet, right? No, so I need to make a choice, right? So if I said, I woke up in the morning, I took a shower, I got in my car, I had a car accident, and then I left the accident. All of a sudden you learn something about me, right? What do you learn about me? Little dishonest, right? A little suspect, right? Maybe things aren't feeling so trustworthy. Okay, but see, so the point is that you didn't learn anything about me until you learned about the way that I responded to a challenge that I faced, right? And that's the way stories work, right? Think about every movie that you've seen. What happens in those movies? There's a character. That character faces a challenge, and they have some uncertainty about how to respond to that challenge. Right? And sometimes it can take 2 hours for them to tell us how they responded to that challenge, right? But ultimately, they make some choice about how to respond to that challenge, and then there's an outcome. And the outcome is what we learn, right? And so that's basically the way stories work, right? If we want to call other people to action, the first thing we have to do is account for what calls us to action. Right? How can I ask someone to join with me in a campaign, in a strike, in a protest, if I can't give them a credible reason for why I think it matters? Right? And so it's really hard for me to stand up here and say, I think inequality is bad, and for that to like inspire legions of people, right, to go running, and join me in a protest, right? But if I can tell a story about a choice that I made that indicates my commitment to working on inequality, that becomes much more powerful, right? And so in telling stories that call people to action, there's a guy named Marshall Gans who's a famous organizer in the United States, and he's developed this sort of structure of telling stories that connect the story of self to the story of us and to the story of now. So what is that, right? The idea basically is that in calling other people to action, we start by telling stories about ourselves, right? What calls me to act, right? That's a lot of what we heard from the panel today, right? But then, remember how one of those emotions that can really inhibit action is the sense of isolation, right? So for people to feel like they want to be able to act, often we want to tell not only stories about ourselves, but stories about our community, right? Who are we? Who is the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Association, right? Or maybe you're talking about your branch, or maybe you're talking about your shift at the hospital, whatever it is, right? The us can be defined in lots of different ways, but the idea is first I tell a story about who I am. That's the story of self. Then I tell a story about who we are. That's the story of us, right? Now, what begins to call people to action, right, is the story of now. And the story of now, basically, the structure is very similar but slightly different, because what the story of now is, it's the opportunity that we have to put the choice in the hands of the other person, right? So not only am I telling you what calls me to action, I'm telling you that you now have a choice about how you can act. And that's what the story of now does. And so what the story of now does is that there's a challenge that we as a union face, that we as nurses face, that we as workers face, right? You can sort of, depending on how you define that we, right? And that we have a choice to make. And that choice is whether or not we're going to take action, right? Now, where does the hope come from in that story? Right? Because we don't know yet whether or not people are going to make that choice. Where does the hope come from? Any thoughts? When you're calling other people to action, right, and you're saying, here's this challenge that we face, what gives people the hope that their choice to sort of act with you is going to make a difference? Say it again. Okay. So hope comes from two things, right? First, a vision of what's possible if we act together, right? The potential outcome that we can achieve. But second, a credible strategy for getting us there, right? So that's where the head and the heart come together, right? So that I can tell you, here's a challenge that we face, here's a choice that you have, here's how we're going to get there together, right? And that's what the story of now does. Now, what I was going to do is show a short video of speech that President Obama gave that sort of gives an example of Story of Us. But in the interest of time, I think I might skip that and then, give you guys some time to practice at your tables. But let's just sort of debrief before we do the practice at your tables. Let's just debrief some of the stories that we heard on the panel today, because I thought they were so excellent that they give, I think, a lot of fodder for everyone to learn from. So as you all think back to the stories that Jane and Andrew and Heather and Glenn told us, what are some of the things, just like off the top of your head, what are the things that you remember most from those stories? You'll have to speak up loud because I have like a thing in my ear. I can't hear that well. Say it one more time. They were personal and relatable. What are some of the specific things that you remember from that made them personal and relatable? Yes. Okay, what do you remember about what do we learn about, what are some of the details that you remember about Jane's story, right? Jane was the first story that went, yet I remember some very specific things from Jane's story, right? Do any of you remember other specific things? The brick through the window, right? That brick through the window, isn't that a powerful image, right? That her family, when she was a kid, she had a brick thrown through her window, right? What else do you guys remember from the stories? I'm sorry, someone said something I can't hear. Wearing black, yep. That she was wearing black in Paris, right, and reading Sartre, okay? Good, right. It's those like specific images, all right? What about from Heather or Andrew or Glenn's story? What do you guys remember?
I think all of them
Uh-huh.
drew from their families, from what their mothers and fathers went through.
Yeah.
And they drew a lot of energy from that.
They all spoke about their families. Now, why did telling us about their families tell us about them? It told us about their passion, but how do we learn about their passion? Because did any of them stand up there here and say, my name is Jane, and I just want to tell you that I'm really passionate? No, so no one said that, right? Yet we learn about their passion. How do we learn about their passion? Okay, so now I'm hearing lots of things. Okay, so I heard someone say that we learned how they responded to adversity, right? All four of them had, in some sense, a challenge, right, that they painted for us, and then we learned about the choice that they made in response to that challenge, right? What else? Okay, what kind of values did we hear? Right, so we learned about values that their family held dear, right? But, you know, when I listened to their stories, I didn't hear any of them say, hi, my name is Heather, and I want to tell you about the values that my family thought were important. Right? Instead, what she did was she told us about how her grandfather picked the wool off the fence, right, from where the sheep had scratched themselves, right? We learned about the brick through the window that Jane told us about, right? I remember from Andrew's story, right, he said yes, right, but what do we learn about his mom, right? That she was Carol Brady turned Mary Tyler Moore, and then she made him Ree, the female eunuch, right? Like, it's like we remember the details, right? And what about Glenn, right? What happened to him in 2004? Right, everyone, yeah. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that when we tell stories, right, the parts of our stories that are the most powerful are the details about the choices that we make, right? So it would have been very different if Jane had just said, I grew up in a union family. I always understood that being a member of a union was really important, right? But instead, I mean, she actually said something like that, but then she illustrated it for us, right, by telling us about that brick in the window, right? And that's what sticks with us half an hour after she spoke, right? And, you know, when we're learning about their families, or we're learning about who those people are, stories are like poetry, right, in the sense that it is through the specific that we learn the general, right? So it's about thinking about what are the details that you can describe about choices that you have made that help people understand who you are. You guys see? Okay, so here's what we're going to do. And do you guys have anything you want to add, by the way, before I... No? You guys good? Okay. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Everyone should have in front of them a packet that looks like this, okay? And if you flip to the 5th page, okay, which looks, it's a worksheet called Developing Your Story of Self. It looks like this. I don't know if you can see it on the video. There you go. Okay. It has like a little blue and yellow pencil in the corner. Okay. We want all of you to spend a few minutes just thinking through what would your story of self look like. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have you turn to your neighbor and each of you share your story of self, right? It's about 3 o'clock now. We're only going to do this until about 3:10 because we want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A. So you're only going to have a couple minutes to tell your story. But in the same way that, each of the people on the panel only had a few minutes, we want to give you guys the opportunity of thinking about telling your story to somebody else and then getting feedback on that. Now, to help you with this activity, there are a bunch of organizers around the room who are going to be roaming around to help organize. Can the organizer just raise their hand so everyone can see you? Okay, so if you need help with this, then call one of the people whose hands are up right now, and they can come around and help you. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to sort of practice writing your own story, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor and start sharing. Okay, so take just a couple minutes now to think about what your own story is. Wait, say it one more time, sir. Okay. Okay, I'm going to give you guys 1 more minute to work on your own story, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor. All right, so just take 1 more minute to work on your own story. Okay, so now everyone turn to your neighbor, preferably try to find someone around you who you don't know, and then practice telling your story, right? Learning to tell stories is like riding a bike, all right? You just got to get on and do it. All right, so just try practicing, and then make sure you give each other an opportunity for each of you to tell your stories. What's it? No. Am I on? I can't say anything. That's great. That's a great story. Looking to the that's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. How was it telling your story? You guys did great, I thought, all of you. Yeah. That process of going through it can be really clarifying in a way. Yeah. Right. Well, also, but telling your own story is different than talking, there's something really personal about it, and so standing up and saying it sometimes can be really hard. Right. You did great. I thought you guys all did great. It was perfect. I didn't even need to use. We had a video all queued up, and I didn't even need to use the video. So. Yeah. That's right. You bumped Obama. How often is that going to happen? They love it. They love it. Yeah. Because so much of university is about, it's all about the head. And they have no opportunity, but these are like young people are trying to figure out their place in the world, and the opportunity to sort of do that in an intentional way. Yeah. Right. Oh yeah. It's like they have a critical eye and a hopeful heart. It's like that's built in. So let me just. Okay, we're gonna have a few more minutes. So if you haven't switched in your partner pair, make sure you switch to give the other person the opportunity to tell their story. And then we'll wrap up in a few minutes. No one listens to me. Oh, yeah, I'll give people 2 more minutes. All right, let's start wrapping it up. Can you guys start wrapping up your discussions? All right, if you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. Thank you. Coral says that in her defense, she works another full-time job and is trying to cover both. All right, fine. Okay, so we have about 15 more minutes, and I want to give you all a chance to sort of ask questions for anyone on the panel. So if you have questions, there's 2 mics up here, so you can just come up and line up behind the mics for anyone who has questions, and then anyone on the panel can answer them. But as you guys start to sort of come up for questions, first give me a sense of what was it like to sort of tell your own story? What were how did it feel to you all? What'd you say? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. No story? It's hard to get to the point where it's a story, right? What's that? Oh, emotional, yeah. Okay, yeah, it's emotional, right? To sort of be able to plumb the sort of depths of what it is that calls you to action. What about others? How did it feel to sort of tell your story and to hear your partner's story? Good? Yeah, so you learn things that you never knew. Sometimes we sit next to people for an entire day, right? And we don't know the most important things about them, right? And so stories are this really powerful way to sort of begin to build that connection and those relationships that Glenn and Jane and others were talking about. Okay, so who has questions they want to ask about stories, about the campaigns that you heard about, or anything else? Or we can tell more stories, because if we don't have questions, then we're going to ask you, some of you guys, to come up and practice telling your story. So who wants to do that? Yeah.
Hi, Eleanor from RPA. I guess I just would like to ask the panellists, I find that the notion of the storytelling really interesting, and everybody that I've heard their stories, it's really moved me, and there's all of those things about, I guess I found connection with each story, even though all of our backgrounds are very different. I'd be interested to know, having started to play with this notion of using stories, have you tried using it in your campaigns, and if you have, or even like things like branch meetings. I'm just trying to think about ways in which we can use it, and how that might open up some of our structures that might have been a little bit staid and have got a bit stuck.
Great question. How can we use stories to sort of open up our work or in our own work? Andrew?
I haven't yet, but where I work in the private health industry, a lot of the staff are Conservative voters. So trying to hook them into the union is against a lifetime of belief for them. But we had an issue over Christmas with some rosters, and I was able to sort of use that to say that it was the union that got them there. And so all you have to do is sign up and just give us some numbers. You don't have to do anything. You just have to be a bum on the seat sometimes. And that was enough to get. So we actually increased our membership by, I don't know, a dozen or so, which is exponential. But as far as moving on into the campaign and the stories and that's about to start, because we've just had the framework given to us, you know. And I mean, I did this 2 weeks ago, I think it was, over at Waterloo when we had the workshop there. And so this is sort of the second time I've done the same exercise, and it's a whole lot better now and a whole lot easier now. So the next time I go to do it, I'm going to be able to shape it to the circumstance.
Good. Glenn?
I did a course recently with the ACTU that involved a lot of the stuff that Hahrie was actually talking about, particularly in terms of the story of self. And we've used it with a couple of our community groups in terms of some of our own personal experiences with health services, with utilising health services. We had one of our members actually share a story in terms of their child being in rehabilitation, and the cost and the advice that they got from a specialist saying to actually utilise the public system instead of the private system for rehab due to expenses. So it was something that was really personal and something that we've actually used already, yeah. So, and it was really effective.
Great. One thing that Andrew said that I just wanted to sort of pick up on is he was saying that every time he tells a story, he can sort of imagine kind of making it more context specific, and that's a really important point, because one thing to know about public narrative or telling stories is that even if you were to do a sort of a full workshop on stories, the idea isn't that you walk out of there with a script, right? A story isn't a script. Instead, it's a way of communicating. Right? So this whole idea behind public narrative, behind story of self and us and challenge, choice, and outcome, it's not that you're going to have one story that you tell all the time, but instead it's about sort of how to think about how do we communicate those things that are the deepest things in our heart, right? How do we communicate things about social justice, about inequality, about commitment to workers' rights, right? How do you communicate that in a way that doesn't seem false, right? And that's what stories do. It's a way of sort of communicating and grounding us in the values and the emotions that sort of move us to act. Good, all right, we have another question here.
I think you've answered the question already that I was going to ask. We're holding a branch meeting on Tuesday because we're so concerned about shortages of midwives down in the Illawarra. And some of the stories that I've got aren't personal stories per se, but I see the social injustice that my colleagues are going through. And for example, we had a BMID who's only 3 months out of training, who's given 14 mothers and 14 babies to look after with an AIN. At the end of the shift, she had over 20 reports to write. She left there in tears. Is it all right to use other people's stories like that to be able to motivate people to act?
Sure. Okay, so the question, is it all right to use other people's stories? So I think that, like I said, so telling stories, it's not a script, right? And so in different contexts, you might use them in different ways. But there are a couple things. When you're leading a campaign, right, when you're trying to ask others to join with you, right, very often if you can't account for your own reasons for being there, then people will make up reasons for you, right? So if I can't sort of give an account for why I'm standing here, then other people will impute or infer things to sort of make them up for me, right? And so very often when you're in that kind of position, you want to be able to tell a story about yourself so they understand who you are, right? But what Story of Us is about is beginning to sort of broaden that so that the challenges that we face are not just our challenges alone, right? They're challenges that we make as a community, and they're choices that we make as a community or as an organization to do something. That tells us about who we can be together, right? And so while you wouldn't want to sort of speak exclusively, I think, about other people's stories, there's sort of a place for that depending on sort of what the context is. Do you guys have anything you want to add on that point? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Goulet from Tamworth, and I'm a midwife. My question is, when you've gone through a campaign and people, it's quite exhausting, there's a lot of effort involved, but you've had some wins, but there's still some things that need to continue to change and to improve. How do you then motivate people who have become, as I think you said, quite jaded, very tired, and find it difficult to be motivated to continue to fight for the changes that need to happen?
I think you have to give them a little bit of time to get over it. You can celebrate your wins by some sort of social get together, you know. But and I think you have to say, well, look, you know, we won that. Now, okay, we did that. Now we've got to use that same sort of techniques or enthusiasm and everything to go to the other things as well. And you know, we won this, so we can do more. You know, we've got runs on the board, we can do more. So I think that's the only way you can do it. But yeah, but I think the more enthusiastic you are, you do actually it's contagious to other people. So, you know, so you have to believe in it to be enthusiastic about it. And then once you are, then usually people will come along with you.
I agree, and I don't think we celebrate enough. And it's actually recognising that we've done something. If we just move on to the next thing, there's no gap, there's no break, it's just a continuum, and it is exhausting. So by recognising that you've had a win, by actually celebrating and acknowledging the people that have been involved, you actually maintain those connections and you maintain that sort of momentum. So it's a really important aspect of it.
Andrew?
I was just going to say, Judith, in her speech before our last break, sort of was talking about the ratio battles and how we sort of let it go as an organisation. I think you've got to maintain the rage. It's maintenance. You've got to keep it going. You don't have to keep it on the boil all the time, but it can be just on a low simmer, but you've just got to keep it going. And I think it's probably easier at a local level just to sort of go around and see people, see how things are. It's all going all right. Yeah, keep it going. We're doing all right. The challenge, I think, is for Judith and the organisation as a whole to keep that going across the state and across the whole system. But I guess we just have to do it if we can keep it going at our level, then I think it makes it easier at a higher level. I don't know.
Yeah, I would just echo what they said, which is that a lot of what we know from research and things like that is that people's commitment when they're burned out, it's sustained not necessarily because their commitment to the issue, it's because their commitment to each other, right? So it's that commitment in those relationships on the ground at the local level that will sort of sustain people and carry people through moments of burnout or pain or any of the other kind of range of emotions that we might experience in any kind of campaign. Okay, so I have to wrap up now and give it over to Brett to sort of close, but I just want to really thank Jane and Andrew and Heather and Glenn for sharing their stories with us. We were going to do a video clip with an example from Obama, but as Andrew put it, they bumped Obama. They were so good. So let's just give them a round of applause.
So thanks very much, Hahrie, for that. And wasn't that inspiring? Haven't you got another tool in your toolbox to go back to your workplace? You had all of that in you. You've got all of that story. You can do it. It's just about being confident about saying, I can model the right story to talk to those people and use that to empower them as it empowers me. You are driven people. You wouldn't be here otherwise, so you can do it. I thank Jane, Andrew, Glenn and Hahrie again for coming out to our conference, taking the time away from the US in summer of all times to come to our horrible winter. Not so horrible, but thank you so much for what you've given us, Hahrie, during your stay with us. We know that you're heading off to Queensland to share with our sister union up there, but it's been fantastic to hear the power of the story and how we can work with our members about unleashing that power to get better outcomes. So thanks again to all of the panel and Hahrie.